The morning Theresa Alden rode the fence line of her newly inherited property and realized that every single border she could see north, east, and west bore the same brand burned into the cedar posts, she told herself it meant nothing at all. The brand was a double C iron, clean and deep, pressed into wood that had been there longer than she had. She traced her finger over one of those marks on a sun-bleached post near the creek crossing, feeling the grooved scar beneath her gloved hand, and she told herself that ranch boundaries were a matter of geography, nothing more. Land touched land. That was simply how the earth worked. It had no intentions. It made no plans. She was wrong about that, though she would not discover the full truth of it for many months. Theresa had arrived in Cimarron County, in the Oklahoma Territory, in the spring of 1887, carrying a leather trunk, her mother's quilt, and a folded deed to 480 acres that her Uncle Horace had willed to her when he died of a fever the previous November. She was 26 years old. With dark hair she kept pinned tight against the wind, brown eyes that took the measure of a thing before she spoke about it, and hands that had known work since she was tall enough to reach a washboard. She had grown up in Missouri, in a house where money was a frequent source of conversation and an infrequent guest, and when the lawyer's letter came with word of Uncle Horace's bequest, she had sat at the kitchen table for a long time just reading it over and over, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more modest. 480 acres, a house with a stone foundation, a barn with a sound roof, a small herd of mixed cattle that the neighbor, and here the lawyer had written a name in his careful script, Mr. Daniel Covington, had been tending through the winter months on a temporary arrangement, awaiting her arrival or her decision to sell. She had not sold. She had come. The town of Ridgecrest was the nearest settlement of any size, about 7 miles south of her property. It had a general store, a post office, a livery, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, 2 saloons, a doctor who also pulled teeth, and a hotel where she spent her first 2 nights before the house was judged habitable enough for a woman alone. The people she met in those first days were a particular kind of cautious about her. They were polite, the way frontier people learned to be polite with strangers, until they knew which category of trouble a stranger belonged to. A woman taking on a working spread by herself fell into a category most of them had not encountered before, and they were working out how to feel about it. The exception was Clara Briggs, who ran the general store with her husband Walt. Clara came around the counter the moment Theresa walked through the door, took both of her hands without being asked, and said, with the directness of a person who had lived too long on open land to waste time on pretense, "You must be Horace's niece. He talked about you every time he came in here, said you had more good sense than anyone he knew. I believed him then, and I believe him now just looking at you." Theresa had felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. "He was a good man," she said. "I miss him." "He was," Clara agreed. "Come on and I'll show you where he kept his account." By the time Theresa drove her rented wagon out to the property for the first time, she had a list of what was there, what was needed, and the general shape of what she was walking into. The house was solid. The barn was sound. The cattle, some 40-odd head that her uncle had been building slowly, were currently grazing on the east pasture of the Covington spread and would need to be moved back. She had written a brief note to Mr. Covington from the hotel, thanking him for the arrangement and informing him that she would be taking possession of the property directly and would be glad to make arrangements to collect her cattle at his earliest convenience. She had received, the following morning, a note in return that was brief and businesslike and entirely unremarkable. "Miss Alden," it had said, "your cattle are in good health. I'll have my men drive them across the creek by end of week. Welcome to the territory. D. Covington." She had read it twice, tucked it into her apron pocket, and thought nothing further about the man who had written it. That lasted about 4 days. She was fixing a loose board on the porch steps. A task the previous occupant had left for later and later had clearly never come. when she heard hooves on the dry ground and looked up to see a man riding toward her from the north. He was on a dark bay horse with a white blaze, riding easy in the saddle with the particular unhurried quality of someone who had been on horseback so long it was simply how they moved through the world. He had his hat pulled against the afternoon sun and a duster that had seen better years but wore them honestly. He was perhaps 30, she estimated, though the sun and the wind out here had a way of making such calculations uncertain. He pulled up at the edge of her yard and touched the brim of his hat. "Miss Alden," he said, "Daniel Covington, I wanted to come introduce myself proper." She set down her hammer and straightened. "Mr. Covington, that's kind of you." He swung down from the horse with a single clean motion, looped the reins over the porch rail with the familiarity of someone who had done it before, and extended his hand. His grip was firm and unhesitating, the handshake of a man who didn't perform manners but had them. "I'm sorry about your uncle," he said. "He was a good neighbor." "Thank you. Everyone keeps saying that and I find it's true every time I hear it." She stepped back slightly and gestured at the porch steps. "I'd offer you a seat, but I'm currently in the middle of making that safer." He looked at the steps, then at the hammer in her hand, then back at her with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. "I can finish that for you in about 10 minutes if you've got an extra nail or two." "I'm perfectly capable of finishing it myself," she said, and she meant it pleasantly but she also meant it precisely. "I don't doubt that," he said, with an easiness that told her he genuinely didn't. "I just thought the offer was neighborly." She considered him for a moment. He was watching her back without any of the patronizing patience she'd encountered from other men who offered help as a way of establishing their necessity. He just looked like a man who knew how to use a hammer and had time this afternoon. "I won't turn down an extra pair of hands," she said, "but I'll be right here working alongside you." "That's exactly the kind of help I was offering," he said. They fixed the porch steps. He worked efficiently and without any need to fill the silence with his own voice, which she appreciated. She asked him at some point how long he'd had his operation to the north of her, and he said he'd been on that land for 6 years, that he'd bought it with money he'd saved from trail driving, and the first 3 years had been hard enough that he thought more than once about going back to driving. "But you stayed," she said. "I stayed," he confirmed, and drove a nail clean with 3 strokes. She asked him about the cattle situation, who had helped him manage them, whether there had been any losses over the winter, and he answered her with the kind of specificity she needed, without any editorializing about whether a woman ought to be managing cattle. He mentioned that he'd lost 2 calves to the cold in January and that both had been sick before the cold came, and that her overall herd was in sound condition and would be ready to move. When the steps were done, she stood on them to test the boards and they held solid. She thanked him. He settled his hat back on his head and untied his horse. "If you need anything," he said, "I'm about 2 miles north along the creek. You can see my barn roof from your north fence line." "I'll keep that in mind," she said. He rode back the way he'd come, and she watched him go for a moment longer than was entirely necessary, then went back inside to make her supper. The cattle came across the creek 3 days later. 2 of his ranch hands, a weathered older man named Pete, and a young Mexican-American hand named Rodrigo, who could barely have been 20, drove the herd, with the kind of skilled quiet that good cowboys used. And by mid-morning, the cattle were on her east pasture and settled. She gave both men coffee and biscuits and thanked them. And Pete, with the air of a man passing along information he thought useful, said that Mr. Covington was a straight-dealing man, and there wasn't a better neighbor to have out here. She thanked him for that too, and she believed it, and she filed it away in the general category of good to know, and moved on to the 100 tasks her property demanded. May became June. The grass came up thick and green along the creek bottoms, the kind of growth that made a cattlewoman feel something close to gratitude for the land itself. Theresa learned the shape of her property by walking it, which was the only real way to learn land. She found the places where the ground went soft after rain, the draw on the south end where cattle liked to shelter in storms, the stand of cottonwoods along the east fence where the shade was dense enough to be worth something in August. She found along that east fence, where her property bordered the Covington land, a line of posts that were in notably better condition than her own, solid and true, and she understood that he had been maintaining that line on both sides, keeping her uncle's fence as well as his own. She made a note to repay that labor in kind when she could. There were other neighbors, too, scattered at the distances that frontier life imposed. The Hargrove family, with their wheat operation a mile to the south, were friendly people with a lot of children and a tendency to appear unexpectedly with food when they thought you might be struggling. Old Marcus Webb, who ran sheep on the far side of the creek and whose property touched hers on a small section of the south line, was gruff in the way of a man who'd been alone long enough to forget some social lubricants, but honest and fair. There was a family of Cheyenne people whose camp was several miles to the northwest, and the relationship between that community and the ranching community was the complicated, painful kind that Theresa recognized as a wrong that had been done and was ongoing, though the particular dynamics of it were not simple to navigate as a newcomer who understood that she herself occupied land that had not originally been settled by agreement. She thought about that sometimes, working the land her uncle had left her, and she thought it was important to think about it rather than not. In June, she rode the full fence line for the first time with the intention of cataloging repairs. She went north first, following the creek, and that was when she noted the double C posts at the north boundary. Then she went west along the north line and found the western fence, where again the posts bore the same brand. Then south along the west side, the same brand. It was only the south fence, the one along the road that ran past the Hargrove wheat fields, that was unmarked by the double C iron. She sat on her horse at the southwest corner of her property, looking at that post, and did the arithmetic of what she was seeing. He was on three sides, north, west, and east. She was bordered on the south by the road and the Hargrove property, but Daniel Covington's land enclosed her on every other side. She thought, that is an unusual configuration for neighboring properties. She thought, it is probably a coincidence of purchase history and how the land was originally surveyed and parceled. She thought, it means nothing. She believed this completely and without any reservation whatsoever, and she rode home and got back to work. Summer in the Oklahoma Territory was not gentle. The heat came down in the afternoons with the weight of something personal, and the grass that had been so generous in May and June began to go gold at the edges by July. Theresa managed her water carefully. She checked the creek daily and was grateful for it. She learned which cattle were trouble seekers and which were steady. She hired a hand, a young man from Ridgecrest named Thomas, 17 years old and saving money to bring his family out from Arkansas, to help with the heavier work 3 days a week. She and Daniel Covington encountered each other with the frequency that shared fence lines produce. There was the afternoon she found a section of her east fence down, blown over in a sudden thunderstorm, and came out the next morning to find him already there, post-hole digger in hand, resetting the line. "You don't have to do that," she said, riding up with her own tools. "I know I don't," he said. "My cattle could go through there too. I've got an interest." She dismounted, and they worked the fence together for 3 hours in the growing heat, and she discovered that he had opinions about fence post depth, which were specific and practical and based on experience with the particular soil compositions near the creek. She had counter-opinions, also based on experience, and the discussion of those differences was, unexpectedly, one of the better conversations she'd had since arriving in the territory. There was the afternoon she discovered that 3 of her cattle had pushed through a weak section of his north fence and gotten into his summer pasture, and she had to ride over to his place to retrieve them. His ranch was larger than she'd expected, a handsome spread with a 2-story house that was plainly built but well-maintained, a substantial barn, 3 smaller outbuildings, and a bunkhouse where Pete and Rodrigo and a third hand named Eli slept. The main house had a porch that looked south and caught the evening light, and flower boxes beneath the windows that she suspected he had not put there himself and had never removed. He'd been cordial about the cattle, had his men help drive them back, and had checked the fence on his side. And in the process, they'd spent another hour working side by side and talking about nothing in particular: the expected rainfall for August, the price of beef at the Dodge City Market, whether the new windmill design was worth the price over a good hand pump. And she'd ridden home in the last of the afternoon sun feeling more at ease than the topic of straying cattle generally warranted. There was the Sunday in August when both of them arrived at the Ridgecrest Church at the same moment from opposite directions, and ended up sitting in adjacent pews, because it was a crowded morning and that was the space available, and she'd been acutely, inexplicably aware of him for the entire service, and had told herself it was because the pews were narrow and close. Clara Briggs, who noticed everything, had caught Theresa's eye on the way out the door and given her a look that said several things without saying any of them aloud. "Don't," Theresa told her. "I haven't said a word," Clara said. "And I appreciate that," Theresa said. Clara smiled and handed her a wrapped parcel of tea she hadn't ordered and hadn't paid for, and told her to come in during the week. The summer progressed. The heat did what heat in Oklahoma does, which is to say it pressed down like a hand on the back of your neck and did not lift for weeks at a time. Theresa worked through it, as did everyone. She learned the rhythms of the land and began to feel, slowly and carefully, the way you feel your way into a room in the dark, that this was hers in a way that went beyond the legal deed. This was the ground where she would make her life. That certainty was still forming in her when the trouble with Marcus Webb began. Webb came to her in early August, on a Thursday evening when the air was still and dry, and he did not look like a man coming to be friendly. He stood at the edge of her yard and told her that the section of fence on her south line, the part where her property met his, was in bad condition, and that 2 of his sheep had got onto her land and been spooked by her cattle, and one of them had broken a leg and had to be put down. She was genuinely sorry about the sheep. She told him so. He told her that he expected her to replace the animal at the current market price, or he'd be taking the matter to the county seat. She examined the fence the following morning. The fence was indeed in poor condition, which was her responsibility to address. The question of whose sheep had pushed through whose fence was a different matter. The evidence she found, the way the posts had fallen outward toward her side, suggested the push had come from his side. She was not certain, but she was not uncertain enough to simply pay without further examination. She wrote Webb a careful letter acknowledging the poor condition of the fence and her intention to repair it within the week, and addressing the question of liability as an open matter that she hoped they could resolve between neighbors without the expense of legal proceedings. Webb did not write back. He showed up 2 days later with the county sheriff, a man named Tate who was polite but clearly uncomfortable, and the situation escalated in the way that frontier disputes between a new woman landowner and an established male neighbor sometimes escalated, which was quickly and with a lot of language about rights and tradition and how things were done out here. She handled herself with a calm that was partly genuine and partly performed, and she held her ground, and the sheriff went away without any resolution in her favor, but also without any formal action against her. She was standing on her repaired porch steps that evening, watching the last of the sunlight turn the grass red, when she heard hooves from the north and recognized the bay horse with the white blaze. Daniel came up to the yard and looked at her and said, "I heard about Webb." "Word travels fast," she said. "It's a small county." He stepped down from the horse. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," she said. It was not entirely true. She was fine in the ways that counted. She was not going to give up. She was not going to be pressured into a payment she didn't owe. She was not afraid of Marcus Webb, but there was a kind of bone-level exhaustion that came from fighting battles you hadn't anticipated when you came out here to simply work your land. "Can I sit?" he asked. She gestured at the porch steps, the ones they'd repaired together in April. He sat on the top step and she sat on the rail, and the evening settled around them. "Webb has a reputation," he said. "Not a violent man, but a man who pushes against any resistance until he finds the edge of it. I've gathered that. He pushed against your uncle once. About water rights on the South Draw. Your uncle didn't move an inch and eventually Webb backed up." "Good to know," she said. "That's exactly what I intend to do." He was quiet for a moment. The creek made its sound in the distance. A night bird called from the cottonwoods. "The fence on your south line was in bad shape," he said. "I should have mentioned it to you when you arrived. I'd noticed it the autumn before when I was out that way looking for strayed cattle." She looked at him. "That's not your fence to maintain." "No," he agreed, "but it's the kind of thing a neighbor might mention." "You might have mentioned it," she said gently, because the tone of it was not blame but something else she couldn't quite name yet. "I should have," he said again. "I'm sorry I didn't." There was something in the straightforwardness of the apology, no hedging, no qualifications. No, but he'd been busy, or but surely she'd have found it herself, that went straight through her careful composure and settled somewhere warmer. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "I'm fixing it." "I know you are." They sat for a while longer, until the sky was fully dark and the stars came out in the enormous way they did over open land, with nothing to diminish them. Eventually he stood and stretched and said he'd better get back, and she said good night, and she watched him ride north into the dark and thought, not for the first time, that this was a man she was coming to trust, and trust out here was not a small thing. The south fence got fixed. Marcus Webb came at her twice more over the following weeks, once through the sheriff, once through a lawyer's letter from the county seat, and both times she responded with the same careful, documented, immovable position, and both times the matter went no further. In October, Webb stopped coming at her altogether, and she understood that he had found the edge of her resistance, and like her uncle before her, she had not moved. By fall, the quality of her life in Cimarron County had settled into something that resembled, cautiously, happiness. The cattle were in good condition going into winter. She had enough put by, with the summer's beef sales, to make the improvements the property needed. Thomas had proven himself a reliable hand, and she'd extended his arrangement through winter and into the following year. She had friends in Ridgecrest, Clara chief among them, and the Hargrove family, who were the kind of neighbors who made difficulty feel manageable simply by existing. And she had Daniel Covington, whose land touched hers on 3 sides, and with whom she had fallen into a pattern of neighborliness so natural and constant that she had, entirely without noticing, begun to shape her days with the assumption that she would see him. She noticed it on a Tuesday in October, when she was expecting him to ride over to discuss the water situation in the North Draw. The creek was running low, and they'd agreed to talk about whether to coordinate their cattle's access, and he was late, and she found herself standing at the kitchen window looking north with a particular kind of attention that had nothing to do with water. She stepped back from the window and went out to check the far pasture, because she needed something to do with her feet. He arrived an hour later, apologizing for the delay. A fence had come down on the far west line, and he'd been working it since morning, and they talked about the creek and the cattle and worked out a sensible rotation between their properties. The discussion was practical and efficient and entirely professional, and she maintained it in that key with great determination. He left in the early afternoon. She watched him go. Then she sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked at the wall and allowed herself, for the first time, to clearly see what she had been carefully not looking at for 6 months. She was falling in love with her neighbor. She sat with that fact for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee and went to check on the south pasture because the cattle weren't going to check on themselves. She told herself several things over the following days. She told herself that she had come out here to build a life on her own terms, and that had not changed. She told herself that a woman who had never depended on a man for her livelihood should be careful about the weight she gave to feelings that arrived so quietly she hadn't even seen them coming. She told herself that he might not feel the same way at all. That neighborliness was simply what it was, and she had misread it. She told herself these things with great conviction, and she kept working, and she kept being his neighbor, and she kept the feelings in a careful corner where they sat and generated warmth like a banked coal. Clara Briggs, who had been watching the situation with the patient attention of a woman who had lived a long life and loved a good story, finally said something in November when Theresa came in for supplies. "He came in yesterday," Clara said, with the casual tone of a woman who was not being casual. "Bought coffee and lamp oil. Stayed about 20 minutes talking to Walt about nothing at all." She paused. "He asked how you were getting on with the winter preparations." Theresa concentrated on the bolt of cloth she was examining. "That's kind of him to ask. He's been asking every time he comes in since about June," Clara said. Theresa set down the cloth. She looked at Clara, who looked back at her with the serene patience of someone holding 4 aces. "You are not subtle," Theresa told her. "Honey," Clara said, "I have been the soul of subtlety. I have been so subtle I could cry." Theresa picked up the cloth again. "He's a good neighbor." "He is also," Clara said, "a man who has been on this land for 6 years without doing more than the minimum required amount of socializing, who does not take Sunday dinners at anyone's house, who goes to church and comes straight home, who has never, to my knowledge, sat on any woman's porch in the dark talking about nothing for 2 hours, which you two did in August because Mabel Hargrove drove past and mentioned it." Theresa's face was warm. She put the cloth down again. "We were discussing the Webb situation. For 2 hours," Clara said. "It was complicated." Clara patted her hand. "Go talk to that man," she said. "Before winter sets in and you spend 4 cold months finding reasons not to." Theresa paid for her supplies and drove home and thought about it for the rest of the day, and then through the night, and then while she was feeding the cattle in the gray early morning, and she came to a conclusion that was not a plan exactly, but was a direction. She was not going to go talk to him. Not yet. She was going to pay attention and see more clearly what was actually there. Because she was a woman who had survived on the frontier for 8 months through good judgment. And good judgment meant knowing what you were looking at before you acted. What followed was, she would later think, the most interesting education she'd ever received. She started looking. Not for reasons to believe something, she was too disciplined for that kind of hoping, but for what was actually present. And what was present was considerable. He found reasons to be at the fence line between their properties with a frequency that the actual condition of the fence did not require. She began to notice. He would materialize on his side of the east boundary on afternoons when the light was good and she was working the near pasture, and they would talk across the fence wire for 20 minutes or an hour about whatever was in front of them. The cattle, the weather, the news from Ridgecrest, the state of the county, and then he would go back to his work and she would go back to hers, and the afternoons felt better for it. He remembered things she said. Not in an attentive, deliberate way, but in the way of someone who was genuinely listening when you spoke. She mentioned in passing in September that her coffee grinder had broken, and 3 weeks later he appeared with a spare one he'd had in his barn and hadn't needed, and offered it without ceremony. She mentioned that the draw on the south end had less shelter than she'd like for the cattle in hard weather, and the next time he rode past, he'd brought a thought about the cottonwood stand, and where she might be able to build a windbreak that would cost her little and serve well. He never overstepped. Never offered help in a way that implied she needed saving, but he watched, and he thought, and he showed up. She was watching a sunset from her north fence in late November, the cold coming in hard and the sky going every shade of copper and rose when she heard him on his side of the line. She turned. He'd ridden out to check something on his own fence and found her there, and he pulled up and looked at the sky. "Those clouds coming in from the northwest," he said. "I think we'll have snow before morning." "First real snow," she said. "Do you have everything set?" "I've got enough wood in and the cattle are in the south draw," she said. "I'm prepared." He nodded, looking at the sunset. The light was coming across the open grass and hitting both their faces in the same gold, and she looked at his profile against that sky and felt the banked coal flare up, and she thought, with a sudden stark clarity, "I'm not going to be able to do this indefinitely." "I never asked you," she said, "why your land is on three sides of mine." He turned to look at her. Something shifted in his face very slightly, like a door that had been closed for a long time moving an inch inward. "That's a particular question," he said. "It's been on my mind," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The sunset was deepening. The cold was settling down through the air like something patient and permanent. "When your uncle first came out here," he said, "the land on the west side of his was unclaimed. I'd bought the north parcel 2 years before, and there was a quarter section on the east that came available, and I bought that too. The west parcel came up for sale about 4 years ago. I bought it." She listened to him with great care. "I knew Horace was getting old," Daniel said. "He didn't have anyone to leave the operation to, far as he knew. I figured if the west parcel went to someone who didn't know the land, or someone who'd run cattle without much regard for the creek management, it'd cause problems for everyone in the draw." He paused. "That was the practical reason." She waited. "The other reason," he said more slowly, "was that I had the idea, which I understood was probably nothing but a notion, that someday there might be someone who'd want to work this land and build something on it. And I thought if the surrounding country was in good hands, that'd be easier." The light was almost gone now, the sky going to deep violet at the edges and dark blue above. "You thought that someone might be me?" she asked. "I didn't know it was going to be you," he said. "I didn't know about you until Horace mentioned his niece in Missouri about 2 years ago." He looked at her directly now, and in the dimming light his eyes were steady and serious and entirely unguarded. "After that I had a somewhat clearer picture," she breathed in. The cold air was sharp in her lungs and the grass smelled like winter coming. "You bought that west parcel 4 years ago," she said. "You said Horace mentioned me 2 years ago." "That's right. So the west parcel was not about me." "No," he said. "The west parcel was about good land management and the creek. The fact that it put me on three sides of a piece of land that would eventually belong to a woman your uncle described as the most capable and clear-eyed person he'd ever known, that was a coincidence." He paused. "Staying on three sides after I knew about you was less of one." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back with the patience of a man who had been patient for years and could wait as long as she needed. "You should have told me this in April," she said. "You'd been here 4 days," he said. "You had 40 head of cattle and a porch that needed fixing and a neighbor already trying to bully you. I thought the information could wait until you'd had a chance to decide what you thought of me. And what if I'd decided I thought nothing of you at all? Then I'd have kept being your neighbor," he said simply, "and been grateful for that." Something in her chest did something large and warm and entirely unhelpful to her composure. She put her hands on the top fence wire, feeling the cold metal through her gloves. "I've been thinking about this fence for about 2 months," she said. "About what it means that you're on three sides." "I know," he said. "I could tell." "You could tell. You got quiet every time you came to the east line," he said. "Not unfriendly, just thinking. You're not a person who gets quiet without reason." She let out a breath that turned to mist in the cold air. "I told myself it was a coincidence," she said, "for quite a long time." "I know that too," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement but was close to it, and close to something more careful and more tender than amusement. "Daniel," she said. "Theresa," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her given name, and the way he said it with the particular weight of a man who had been not saying it for many months and was now finally permitted, made her close her eyes for a moment. "This spring," she said, "when you came over and fixed the porch steps with me." "Yes." "Was that—" She paused. "Yes," he said. "You'd already before you even met me." "Horace showed me a photograph," he said, and the admission was made with a quiet dignity that was both embarrassed and unashamed. "About 1.5 years ago. He said he was thinking about writing to you about the place, that he thought you'd love it out here if you'd only see it. He said you'd been stuck in Missouri not because you wanted to be, but because you hadn't had a reason to leave yet. He said all you needed was something of your own and you'd fly. She felt tears behind her eyes, which she did not permit because the air was too cold, and she did not cry at fence lines if she could help it. He never told me any of that, she said. He was working up to the letter when he got sick, Daniel said, but he talked about it enough that I knew it was coming. When I got word he'd passed and that you were inheriting, he stopped. You what? She asked. I made sure the cattle were well and the barn was sound and the east fence line was in good repair, he said. And I waited. The first snow of winter arrived that night, as he had predicted. It came down in the quiet, dark hours before dawn, and by morning the whole territory was white and still and remade, the grass covered, and the creek running dark between white banks and the sky, a flat pale gray that promised more before evening. Theresa stood on her porch in the early morning with her coffee and looked out at the changed world, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled since April. Not certainty about the future was never certain out here, but certainty about the direction, the ground she stood on, the borders of the thing she was building. She went inside and wrote a letter to Clara Briggs which said only, "You were right. Don't say I told you so." Clara's response arrived 2 days later and said only, "I told you so." She put it in her pocket and smiled and went to see about the cattle. Daniel came over that afternoon, with a load of firewood in his wagon that he said he had more of than he needed this winter, and they unloaded it together into the stack by her side door, and the work kept them warm in the cold air. And when they were done, she invited him in for coffee, which was the first time she'd done so. Her kitchen was small and warm, with the iron stove burning and the smell of the biscuits she'd made that morning still in the air. He hung his hat on the hook by the door with an ease that suggested he felt welcome, and she found she had no objection to that whatsoever. He sat at her kitchen table and she poured the coffee, and they talked for a long time, the way they'd been talking for months, but differently now, without the careful borders. He told her about his family. His parents were in Kansas, his father an aging farmer, his mother a woman who sounded a great deal like Clara Briggs, and about the years on the cattle drives before he'd settled, about the particular summer on the Kishom Trail when they'd lost half the herd to a flash flood, and he decided that trail driving was a good way to see the country and a poor way to build anything in it. She told him about Missouri, about her parents and the years of tight money and tight hope, about learning early that if you wanted something you'd better build it yourself because no one else would do it for you. She told him about her Uncle Horace, who had come out to visit when she was 15 and had sat at a dinner table where the adults were discussing the impossibility of changing their circumstances, and had quietly and without fanfare mentioned that the territory had land and the land was there for the taking if you had the nerve for it. He always made it sound possible, she said. That was his gift, Daniel said. He did that with everyone. Did he do it with you? He did, Daniel said. I came out here and bought that north parcel and the first year almost broke me, and Horace came over in November and sat at my table and told me about the third year when it turned. He said every man's got a third year and you just had to hold through to it. Did he tell you about his third year? He told me about 5 third years, Daniel said, with a real smile now, the kind that went all the way to his eyes and changed the whole aspect of his face. Every one of them better than the last. She laughed, which she hadn't expected, and he laughed too, and something between them that had been warming for months reached a kind of temperature that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. The winter settled in hard. It was a January and February that tested everyone in Cimarron County 3 serious snowstorms, temperatures that dropped in the nights to something that made even the hardiest ranch hands curse, and a period in early February when the creek froze solid for 2 weeks, and the water situation required serious management. Theresa's cattle came through it well, largely because her preparations had been thorough, and because she spent the worst nights in the barn, sleeping on the hay, making sure nothing froze to death on her watch. Daniel helped when help was needed, and in ways that were genuinely needed, which by now she could tell from ways that were offered from obligation or from a need to be necessary. When the storm in January took part of her roof off the smaller outbuilding, he showed up with Pete and Eli and the materials needed, and they had it patched in a day. She fed them all lunch and worked alongside them, and Pete, eating her biscuits, looked between her and Daniel with the expression of a man watching a thing he'd been waiting a while to see coming together. There were evenings when the cold outside made the distance between properties feel like an argument, and those evenings she read by the lamp or mended or wrote letters, and she thought about what it would be like to have that kitchen warm with more than one person in it, and she let herself think it without apology. In February, on a clear cold Sunday after church, he asked if he could call on her properly. They were standing in the cold outside the church, with the rest of Ridgecrest streaming past them on either side, and he turned to her after the usual Sunday pleasantries and asked it with the directness she'd come to associate with him, no preamble, no performance of confidence he didn't feel, just the question placed carefully in front of her. "You've been calling on me since April," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'd like to do it with an understanding of what it is." She looked at him. The cold was making her breath mist. Behind him, she could see Clara Briggs heading for her wagon with the very particular deliberate non-looking of a woman who was looking extremely hard. "What do you think it is?" she asked. "I think," he said, "that I would like to court you to Theresa if that's something you're open to. I know you came out here to build something of your own, and I'm not asking you to change any part of that. I'm asking to be in it if there's room." She thought of 8 months of fence lines and shared labor and conversations at kitchen tables in the winter dark, and she thought of the way he'd said her uncle's words she'd fly, and she thought of a man who had bought land on 3 sides of a piece of property and waited with patient, genuine, undemanding hope. "There's room," she said. The smile that came across his face was not the controlled, neighborly expression she'd been seeing for months. It was something else entirely. It was relief and joy and the particular warmth of a man who had been carrying something carefully for a long time and had finally been told he could set it down. "Good," he said. And then, after a moment, more quietly, "Good." Clara Briggs, getting into her wagon, did not say anything. She simply smiled at the sky with the expression of a woman who had been entirely right about a thing from the very beginning. Spring came back to Cimarron County in March, creeping up from the south the way it always did, first in the color of the creek bank, and then in the temperature of the midday air, and then in the grass, which came up green again as if the winter had never happened. Theresa's cattle had come through with minimal losses. She was proud of that, and she had a right to be, and the property looked better than it had the previous spring, because she knew it better now, knew where it wanted attention and where it was fine on its own. Courtship on the frontier was a different kind of animal than it was in the cities. There were no parlors to call at in the formal way, no chaperones hovering with their particular brand of useful social theater. What there was Sunday afternoons, and the occasional evening supper and rides across the shared land between their properties, and conversations that ranged far and held nothing back, because neither of them was the kind of person who had patience for the version of courtship that was mostly performance. He took her to Ridgecrest on a Saturday in March, to the general store and then to the hotel dining room for supper, and the whole town of Ridgecrest noticed and the whole town of Ridgecrest approved. And Walt Briggs shook Daniel's hand with the emphatic energy of a man who'd been silently rooting for this outcome for quite some time. She let him hold her hand on the walk from the hotel to the livery, in the cool March evening with the first stars coming out, and she felt the warmth of it go all the way up her arm and into the region of her chest where she'd been banking that coal since August, and that coal blazed up now with no banking required. "I've been wanting to do that since the first Sunday at church," he said. "I know," she said. "You know. I noticed," she said. "I notice most things." He shook his head slightly with the rueful expression of a man recalibrating. "How long did you know?" "November," she said, "at the north fence." I thought maybe December. November, she confirmed. The sunset. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about that. That's a month I spent thinking you might need more time. I didn't need more time, she said. I needed to understand what I was looking at. He looked at her in the starlight. And what were you looking at? A man, she said, who bought land on 3 sides of a piece of property and waited for someone to arrive and build a life on it, without ever once trying to hurry that along or make it easier than it was or take any of it away from her. He was quiet with that. That's a man worth looking at carefully, she said. He stopped walking. She stopped too. They were between the hotel and the livery, in the dark quiet of the Ridgecrest Main Street with the town settling into its evening around them, and he looked at her for a moment with everything he'd been carrying for months visible in his face. "Theresa," he said. "Daniel," she said. He kissed her in the street in Ridgecrest in the Oklahoma Territory in the spring of 1888. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been patient long enough and was now certain of his ground, and she kissed him back with equal conviction, because she was a woman who, when she made a decision, committed to it fully. Down the street, the door of the Briggs General Store opened and Clara's voice floated out into the night air. "Walt, you owe me $2. April came warm and generous, and the year turned over into something new. Theresa worked her land with the particular satisfaction of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do in the place they were meant to do it. The cattle were fat on the spring grass. The house had been improved over the winter. She'd put in a second window in the kitchen, which let in the morning light in a way that made the whole room feel different, and she had plans for a proper vegetable garden along the south side where the soil was deep and the drainage was good. She and Daniel found the rhythm of 2 lives that were adjacent and complementary without being merged, which was exactly what she had wanted, and exactly what he had seemed to understand she would want. He came for Sunday supper most weeks. She rode over to his place when the east fence line needed discussion, or when she wanted company she trusted. They worked together on the shared projects that 2 ranches running side by side always produced, and the work was better for 2 people who were genuinely in it as equals. He met her in the east pasture one afternoon in April and said, in the same direct way he'd asked to court her, that he thought they might be well suited to build something together that would last longer than either of them, and he wanted to know if she'd consider it. "Are you proposing marriage?" she asked. "I'm asking if you'd consider it," he said. "The proposition comes after the consideration." She looked at him, on his bay horse with the white blaze, in the warm April afternoon with the grass green around them and the creek running fast from the spring melt, and she thought about what she had come to this territory to build and whether the shape of it had room for this, and she knew, with the same calm certainty with which she'd known about the ground and the cattle and the fences, that it did. "I'll consider it," she said. "That's all I'm asking," he said. She considered it for exactly 4 days, which was about 3.5 days longer than she actually needed, because she was a woman who believed in due diligence even when the answer was already present. On the 5th day, she rode to his north boundary and called his name from the fence line, and he came out from the barn where he'd been working and walked across his pasture to the fence, and she said, "Yes, that's my consideration." He looked at her with the large quiet of a man who is not capable in this moment of saying anything smaller than what he feels, and then he said, "Theresa." "Daniel," she said. They were married in June, in the Ridgecrest church, on a morning that was warm and bright and smelled of the prairie grass in full summer growth. Clara Briggs stood up with Theresa, and Pete, the old ranch hand who had been with Daniel since the first year, stood with him, looking slightly pained by the formality of the collar he'd been pressed into wearing. The whole county seemed to come, the Hargroves with all their children, Walt Briggs with his best hat, the doctor who pulled teeth, and a dozen other families who had watched these 2 people work their adjacent lands for a year and a half and had come to their own conclusions. The minister said the words. They said theirs. When it was done, and Daniel held her hand at the altar, and she looked at him in the warm light of that June morning, She thought about a line of cedar posts bearing a double C brand stretching along 3 sides of her land. And she thought about all the things she'd told herself those posts meant and didn't mean. And she thought, I was wrong for quite a long time, and I am very glad about that now. The reception was on the Covington, now Covington Alden property, on the large south porch with its good view of the shared land, and Clara Briggs produced a wedding cake that was an act of considerable ambition given the limitations of a frontier kitchen, and Walt gave a toast that was short and heartfelt and made 2 of the Hargrove women cry. Pete, leaning against the porch rail with a glass of cider, said to Rodrigo quietly, I knew in the first week he brought those cattle back to her place. Rodrigo said, I knew when he started riding the east fence twice a day. They both nodded with the satisfied air of men who have been proved correct. The question of the property had been discussed and settled between them with the same practicality they brought to everything. The 2 ranches shared the creek, shared certain water rights and shared fences, and the new arrangement recognized this formally. Her land remained hers under her name, which was a thing that mattered to her, and which he had not only agreed to but had said, without any hesitation at all, that it should be that way because it was hers. You built it, he'd said. I'm not going to put my name on it. You fixed my porch steps, she'd said. You did most of the fixing, he'd said. I just handed you nails. She had loved him for that. She had loved him for a great many things, but that particular thing she had held close. The summer of 1888 was good to them. They moved between the 2 properties as the work required, living primarily in her house, which was smaller but had been improved, while plans were made to add onto the Covington house in the north. The cattle on both spreads did well. The summer rains came at intervals sufficient to keep the creek running and the grass green through July. Rodrigo, who had been with Daniel 3 years, decided in August to move on to New Mexico territory where his family had land, and they gave him a good going-away supper and a horse and a month's wages ahead. And Daniel hired on a young woman's brother from Ridgecrest named Samuel who proved, in the way of people who are trying very hard, to be worth the effort of training. Marcus Webb, perhaps influenced by the wedding and the reconfiguration of Theresa's support, had not troubled them since the previous autumn. She saw him occasionally in Ridgecrest, and he was civil in the way of a man who has assessed his options and found the trouble-making one unprofitable. The work with the Cheyenne community to the northwest had been a thing she'd thought about since arriving. There had been a particular injustice playing out in the territory during these years. The pressure on native people to cede more and more land, the enforcement of policies that broke up traditional ways of living, the whole apparatus of federal authority bearing down on people who had been on this land far longer than any of them. She could not fix that, and she was clear-eyed about what she could and couldn't do. But when a young man from that community came to the south fence in late summer to ask if there was a possibility of trade, he was trading worked leather goods for grain and cattle, she said yes, and they worked out an arrangement that was fair and ongoing, and she told Daniel about it, and he said simply, "That's a good trade. I'd like in on it too if there's room." There was room. It was not enough. It was never going to be enough in the way that would address the full scale of what had been done. But it was something that was honest and respectful, and she held on to that. In the fall, she found out she was expecting. She told Daniel on a Thursday evening in the kitchen over supper, and he sat very still for a moment and then set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was a combination of joy and wonder and a kind of reverence that undid her completely. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm quite all right," she said. "I'm better than all right." He came around the table and held her with the careful, encompassing gentleness of a man who is aware that he is holding something more than himself, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and allowed herself, for a few minutes, to simply be held. "Horace would have loved this," she said. "He would have been insufferable about it," Daniel agreed. "In the best possible way." She laughed against his shoulder. He held her tighter. The winter of 1888 into 1889 passed with the particular mixture of tedium and intensity that frontier winters always had. The preparations were good, the storms were manageable, and the growing knowledge of the child coming in spring was a warmth that nothing outside could touch. She continued working through the winter with adjustments for common sense, and Daniel managed the worst of the outdoor work without ever suggesting that she needed to be kept away from hers, which would have resulted in a conversation he was wise enough to want to avoid. Clara Briggs came out in January with enough fabric to make 4 separate things for a child and opinions about all of them, and Theresa sat at her kitchen table across from her oldest friend in the territory, and felt the depth of what had grown up around her in less than 2 years: land, cattle, a husband whose character she trusted as completely as she trusted her own, neighbors who were woven into the fabric of her days, and now this new person coming. "You're happy," Clara said. "Not a question." "Profoundly," Theresa said. "Horace would be proud of you," Clara said. "He'd be proud of the cattle operation," Theresa said. "That too," Clara agreed. "But mostly you." The baby came in April as the grass was returning. It was a boy. He came into the world on a Tuesday morning, helped by the doctor from Ridgecrest and attended by Clara, and Theresa held him in the spring light coming through the kitchen window, the one she'd put in herself, the one that caught the morning and looked at his face. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at them both with an expression that Theresa understood was the permanent revision of his entire understanding of what the word everything meant. They named him Horace Daniel Covington, after the man who had started all of it. After the man who had talked about his niece in Missouri to a neighbor who listened, and who had in the end made it all possible. The summer the baby was 6 months old, Theresa stood at the north fence line, Horace Daniel on her hip, watching the grass with wide, dark eyes that looked exactly like his father's. And she looked out at the land that touched hers on 3 sides and thought about all the ways in which she had been wrong, and all the ways in which being wrong had led her directly here. She had thought it was a coincidence. She had thought it for 6 months, riding fence lines and noting the double C brand, telling herself that land touched land and it meant nothing. She had been so thoroughly, so completely wrong, and the wrongness of it had led her to a life that was, in every direction she looked, exactly what she had come out here to find. Daniel came out of the barn and saw her at the fence and walked across the pasture to where she stood. He reached her and looked at his son, who grabbed at his father's duster with a focused, determined grip, and then he put his arm around Theresa's shoulders. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How long I thought it was a coincidence," she said. He looked at the fence posts, their double C brands visible in the morning sun. "And now?" "And now," she said, "I'm thinking that some things look like coincidence for a long time, and then you understand them, and then you're grateful for every fence post and every fence line and every acre of land that put you where you needed to be." He pressed a kiss to her temple. The baby made a sound that was clearly an opinion on something. "He's going to be opinionated," Daniel said. "He comes by it honestly," she said. They stood at the north fence in the morning light, the 3 of them, with the land spreading out in every direction, and the creek running in the distance, and the grass moving in a slow wind that came down from the north, from across the land that had always been his, where the road of all of this had begun. 2 years later, in the spring of 1892, when Horace Daniel was learning to walk with the stumbling, passionate determination of a child who has decided the floor is optional, and when Theresa's cattle operation had grown to 120 head and was considered one of the best managed spreads in Cimarron County, and when the house had been expanded with a room on the north side that got the afternoon light and smelled like cedar, she found out she was expecting again. This time the news arrived in the evening after supper, and she told Daniel while they were sitting on the south porch watching the last of the light, and he made a sound that was not quite a word and was entirely sufficient. "Another rancher," he said. "Or another rancher," she said. "You don't know yet." "Either way," he said. "Another rancher." She leaned against him on the porch of the house that had been her uncle's and was now hers and was now both of theirs. And she looked out over the land that had come to her through grief and luck and the particular generosity of a man who'd believed she would fly, and she thought, yes, another rancher, another Covington, another life built on this ground. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1892, a year that was cold and beautiful and full. They named her Horace. Daniel's opinion on the name, enthusiastically communicated by pointing at things and yelling, was noted and set aside. She was called Clara Covington, for the woman who had handed Theresa a cup of tea she hadn't ordered and had been the first to make her feel at home in a land she was still learning. Clara Briggs, when she heard, sat down in the chair behind the store counter and put her hand over her heart and said absolutely nothing for about 30 seconds, which was the quietest Walt had ever seen her. The years that followed were the kind that a person, looking back, understands as the substance of their life. The children grew. The land prospered. Daniel and Theresa worked it together with the same fundamental equality with which they'd come to each other, two people who were each whole and capable on their own terms, and who had chosen, in full knowledge of what they were and what they valued, to build something together that was larger than either of them alone. Horace Daniel turned 5 and showed every sign of being the kind of child who would learn to ride before he could reliably walk in a straight line, which would have been alarming in a different household. Clara from the age of about 2, had opinions about the cattle that she communicated by going to the south pasture and standing at the fence and addressing the animals directly, which the cattle bore with the equanimity for which the species is known. The Webb situation had fully resolved itself, as these things sometimes do when the pressuring party runs out of options. Marcus Webb sold his sheep operation in 1890 and moved to the county seat, and the land south of Theresa's property was purchased by a young couple from Tennessee who were cheerful and hardworking and entirely neighborly. Their arrival completed the bordered feeling of the spread. Now, on all 4 sides she had people she could count on, and the shape of the country around her felt, finally, like a thing that was fully itself. In 1893, when the country was dealing with the financial panic that devastated a great many people across every industry, Daniel and Theresa managed through it with the careful, practiced efficiency of people who had always operated on the principle that you prepared for the bad years during the good ones. They lost some value on their beef sales, as everyone did. They pulled back on plans to extend the cattle numbers that year. They got through it. Pete, the old ranch hand who had been with Daniel since the first year, and had driven Theresa's cattle back across the creek in that very first April, finally retired in the autumn of 1893, at an age that was somewhere in the vicinity of 65 but which he refused to specify. They gave him a supper that felt like a small celebration of the entire territory, and Pete sat at the table and looked at Theresa and Daniel and the children and the whole gathering of people who had accumulated around their lives, and he said, with the economy of a man who'd spent most of his life outdoors where words were a luxury, "This turned out right." No one disagreed. There were hard things too, because a life on the frontier did not withhold its harder elements from anyone, and Theresa had always known that. She lost a stand of cattle to a disease outbreak in 1894 that took 6 weeks to understand and control, and it cost her a portion of the herd she'd built. She grieved that the way a rancher grieves, which is to say with practical grief, with the understanding that the land would give again, with the keeping of records so you knew exactly what you had and what you'd need. Daniel worked alongside her through it and did not manage her grief for her, and did not tell her it would be fine in ways that would have been dismissive, and she was grateful for all the things he did not do as much as for all the things he did. She thought sometimes, in those harder moments, about what it meant to have built something, about the particular way that a life, when it was built rather than simply fallen into, had a weight and a texture that you could feel when you held it. She had come out here with a leather trunk and her mother's quilt, and a deed to land she'd never seen, and she had made something of it. She had made something of herself on it. And she had found, on three sides of that land, a man who had been waiting with the kind of patience that is only possible when you genuinely believe in the thing you're waiting for. She told Horace Daniel this story, in pieces, over the years, in the way parents tell children the story of how they came to exist. She told him about the fence posts and the double C brand and the long months during which she told herself it was coincidence. She told it as a story of the land first, because it was, and of the people second, because they were part of the land. He listened the way children listen to stories that are about them in a way they don't yet fully understand, with one ear toward the tale and one ear toward some distant thing that the story points at. Clara Me listened with both ears and no distance at all. She wanted all the details. She wanted to know exactly what the fence posts looked like, and how the sunset had looked in November, and what the words of the wedding service had been. She had an archivist's instinct, that girl, even at 5 years old. The land changed around them over those years. The Oklahoma Territory was changing too. The pressure toward statehood, the ongoing conflicts over land allotment, the reconfiguration of how the territory was organized and governed. Theresa followed these developments with close attention because she understood that land and law were not separate things, that what happened in the county seat and what happened in Washington eventually arrived at every fence line. She corresponded with other women landowners in the territory. There were more of them than most people acknowledged. And she read the papers, and she had opinions about all of it that she expressed with the directness her uncle had admired in her. Daniel said once that she should have been in the territorial legislature, and she told him she'd do more good on her 480 acres than in any chamber full of men arguing about land they'd never worked. He said that was probably true, and she said it was definitely true, and they both went back to their respective tasks. By 1895, when Horace Daniel was 6 and Clara Me was 2, going on considerably older, the spread was something that people in Cimarron County pointed to when they talked about what a well-run cattle operation looked like. Not the biggest, not the most famous, but efficient and sound, and managed with a quality of attention that showed in the health of the grass and the condition of the cattle and the maintenance of the fences. People came to ask Theresa about her management of the creek water, and she told them without charge everything she knew about it, because the creek went through everyone's land eventually, and what benefited the creek benefited them all. There was a young woman who arrived in Ridgecrest in the spring of 1895, 23 years old and recently widowed, with a small inherited piece of land to the northeast and very little knowledge of what to do with it. Her name was Alice Pemberton, and she had Clara Briggs's kind of directness and no one's patience for being condescended to. Theresa met her at the general store and recognized, in a way that had the warmth of memory in it, exactly what she was looking at. She invited Alice to come out to the property the following Sunday. Alice came, and they walked the fence lines, and Theresa showed her how to read the ground for water and the sky for weather, and she gave her the same practical, unvarnished knowledge of the territory that her uncle had given her, in the full belief that a woman with something of her own on this land was an addition to everything that mattered about it. Alice listened with the focused intensity of someone who understands that every piece of information is a nail in a structure they're building in a hurry. By summer, Alice had her cattle in reasonable order and her fences solid. By autumn, she was holding her own. Theresa watched it with the satisfaction of someone who has passed something along that was worth passing. The afternoon Theresa rode her fence line for what must have been the 100th time, the north line, with its double C posts on Daniel's side, still there, still bearing the brand that she had once told herself meant nothing. She pulled her horse to a stop at the northeast corner and looked across the territory. 8 years had passed since she'd arrived in April of 1887 with her leather trunk and her mother's quilt and her careful, independent heart. The land was the same land, broad and open and demanding, running flat toward the horizon with the creek catching the afternoon light somewhere in the middle distance. The cattle were grazing on the east pasture. Smoke was coming from the chimney of the house that was hers and had been built, little by little, into the home she'd been building in the back of her mind since before she'd known what it would look like. She heard hooves from the north and turned. Daniel on his bay, a different bay now. The original horse had lived a full good life and been retired 5 years ago, but he'd chosen another bay with another white blaze. As if he could not quite give up that particular habit, came along his side of the fence and pulled up. "Children are with Clara Briggs," he said, because that was how their Sunday afternoons sometimes went, the children at the Briggs house eating cookies and absorbing opinions. "I thought I'd come find you." "You knew where to look," she said. "I usually do," he said. She looked at the fence post between them, at the double C brand burned into the cedar. It was older now, the wood weathered and gray, but the brand was deep and clear. "You know," she said, "I spent a long time looking at these posts and telling myself they meant nothing." "I know," he said. "You told me." "I was very certain about it," she said. "Very logical." "You are the most logical person I have ever met," he said with affection. "And yet," she said. "And yet," he agreed. She looked at the brand and then at him, on his bay horse with the afternoon light on his face, and she thought about 8 years of fence lines and fence repairs, and a marriage that had been, in its fundamentals, the same as the land they worked, demanding and generous and full of seasons, requiring attention and patience and the willingness to be present for all of it, the hard and the beautiful alike. "I'm glad I was wrong," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I'm glad I had the sense to stop being wrong when the evidence was sufficient." "The evidence was always sufficient," he said. "You just needed to be ready to see it." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes from long knowledge of a person and the ease of long happiness. She reached across the fence and he met her hand halfway, and they held on for a moment in the afternoon quiet with the land spreading out around them in every direction, hers and his and theirs, 480 acres of her own and the rest of it alongside, all of it marked and tended and grown into something that would last beyond either of them. "Come home," she said. He turned his horse and she turned hers, and they rode south along the fence line together, back toward the house with the smoke rising from the chimney, back toward the children who would come home with cookies in their pockets and stories from Clara Briggs that would require the better part of the evening to fully tell, back toward the life that had been built on this ground, carefully and on purpose, out of everything a person needed and nothing they could do without. The fence posts stood in their rows, bearing the double C brand on 3 sides of the land that was hers, as they had stood for years and would stand for years more. No coincidence in the end. No accident of survey or geography or purchase history. Only the particular, patient, unhurried shape of a thing that had been tended from a long way off, waiting for the right person to arrive and recognize it. She had been the last to see it clearly, but she had seen it finally, and she had held on to it with both hands, and the holding had been the best work of her life. The evening settled over Cimarron County, the way evenings always did out here, in slow gold layers, in the long light that made the grass look like something lit from inside. Theresa Alden, who was also Covington and was first and always herself, rode home through it with her husband at her side, and the land ran out in every direction around them, wide and true and entirely, completely hers.